Princeton University's Keller Center, educating leaders for a technology-driven society.
So good afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Vince Poore, the Dean of the School of Engineering and Applied Science here at Princeton. And I'm delighted that Tim Brown and Tom Kelly are with us today. This afternoon's conversation is called Building Your Creative Confidence Through Design Thinking, Lessons from 30 Years of Innovation at IDEO. And this will be moderated by Professor Derek Liddell, sitting here. Today's event is sponsored by the Keller Center and is part of the G.S. Beckwith Gilbert Class of 1963 lecture series. I'm going to say a few things about Tim, Tom, and IDEO, as well as Derek, in just a few minutes. But let me first say a little bit about the genesis of why we're all standing and sitting here today. It might be sort of obvious that many units here at Princeton would be very interested in hearing about the mastermind, hearing from the masterminds of IDEO. The interest in doing so, though, by the Keller Center might seem a little less obvious to you. So let me say a little bit about the Keller Center and its mission, and then maybe it'll become more obvious why it is sponsoring this event. So as many of you know, the Keller Center is now close to 10 years old. It was endowed by one of our alumni, Dennis Keller, and his wife, Connie, and with a mission of educating leaders for a technology-driven society. So the center began by sponsoring and developing courses and other experiential learning opportunities that would bring students together from all across campus. And it's been extremely successful at doing that. Many students are served by the programs of the Keller Center. It also became clear a few years ago that entrepreneurship and innovation were also key vehicles for teaching about technology and for leading through technology in society. And so in recent years, the Keller Center has also been very active in promoting entrepreneurship here on campus. Well, design, I see some people have the sun in their eyes, sorry about that, it'll move. Design is another area like entrepreneurship through which leadership can be viewed. Now design, as you all know, is a critical juncture between ideas and action. So we all are familiar with the scientific method where scientists, in order to test their theories, design experiments to test them in the real world. And engineering and other creative fields also have this process. We have ideas, theories, but in order to prove them to society, to prove their value to society, in business, in government, or other aspects of culture, we really need to design things from these theories that can be tested in the real world and through which the importance of the ideas or the value of the ideas can be proved to society. So design is also a lens through which to view and approach problems in general. So it's in this light that the Keller Center decided to invite Tim and Tom here today, and then they very graciously accepted. So, as many of you know, IDEO is an award-winning global design firm, so there's the word design again, that takes a human-centered, design-based approach to helping organizations, both in the public and private sectors, to innovate and grow. They identify new ways to serve and support people by uncovering latent needs, behaviors, and desires. They also help organizations build creative cultures and the internal systems required to sustain innovation and launch new ventures. Tim Brown is the CEO and president of IDEO. He frequently speaks about the value of design thinking and innovation to business people and designers around the world. He participates, for example, in the World Economic Forum at Davos. He has several TED Talks that you can view. He's an industrial designer by training. He's earned numerous design awards and has exhibited works at a variety of places worldwide, including the Axis Gallery in Tokyo, the Design Museum in London, and MoMA. He takes special interest in the convergence of technology and the arts, which is another thing that has quite a bit of traction here at Princeton. as well as the ways in which design can be used to promote the well-being of people living in emerging economies. Tim advises senior executives and boards of Fortune 100 companies and has led strategic client relationships with such organizations as the Mayo Clinic, Microsoft, PepsiCo, Procter & Gamble, etc. He also writes for the Harvard Business Review, The Economist, and other prominent publications. His book on how design thinking transforms organizations, entitled Change by Design, was released by Harper Business in September of 2009. Tim is also a parent of a current Princeton undergraduate. So, Tom Kelly, she's here today. Tom Kelly is the best-selling author of Creative Confidence, The Art of Innovation, and The 10 Faces of Innovation, as well as a partner at IDEO. As a leading innovation speaker, Tom addresses scores of business audiences on how to foster a culture of innovation and tap into the creative potential of their organizations. Over the years, Tom has spoken in more than 30 countries and helped IDEO grow from 15 designers to a staff of more than 600, while leading diverse areas such as business and development, marketing, human resources, and operations. Tom is an executive fellow at the Haas School of Business at Berkeley and holds a similar role at the University of Tokyo. He's also the father of a Princeton undergraduate who's here today. So you're beginning to see a trend, I think. Derek Litto, today's moderator, as a longtime global CEO, innovator, and startup coach, he's widely known as one of the world's top experts on the electronics industry. His contributions range from patents to value chain applications that have forever improved companies as diverse as Sony, Samsung, Philips, Goldman Sachs, and IBM. Among his many accomplishments, Derek is a successful entrepreneur who built iSupply, a leading market research firm. In 2010, he sold this company for $100 million to global information leader IHS. Today, you notice I called him Professor Littow. Derek is here with us at Princeton. He's giving back by teaching courses, one for several years, entrepreneurial leadership, and a new one that he's teaching just this term called Creativity, Innovation, and Design. And he's also working with young companies and aspiring entrepreneurs. He's also a public intellectual and a media commentator in this field. He's been covered by publications such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Bloomberg, The Economist, and so forth and so on. So Tim and Tom, thank you very much for being with us today. Derek, thank you for running the show. So please join me in welcoming them.
Well, it sounds like we have our work to cut out for us. But, I'd like to start by talking about design and design thinking, because design thinking is certainly something that's become very popular, and yet you make a clear distinction between it and design. And I think that it's an important distinction that you make, and we should start there.
Yeah, I mean, probably in an ideal world, one wouldn't have to make that distinction, but like so much of what we do in the world, it's based on sort of historical precedent. We might be losing the sun for those of you. Oh, wrong curtains. And so, we could have a little critique on good design versus bad design when it comes to maybe your class could next year's project.
Next year's project.
I mean, design has a long track record of being associated with the artifacts, particularly of the Industrial Revolution. Right? I mean, whether it's fashion design, communications design, graphic design, if you like, and industrial design largely kind of emerged. Now nobody can see anything.
Right. Flashlight out.
Largely emerged through the Industrial Revolution, and we sort of associate them with the form of those things. So, how products look, how album covers, for those of you who remember albums, book covers, for those of you that remember books, how those things look, and It's quite hard competing with blind. I never expected to be upstaged by blinds. It's fascinating. And yet, underneath all of that, there's a sort of what one could think of as an operating system, which is, I think, how we would describe design thinking, is that the output of the various fields of design that have been sort of traditional ones, and you might extend that to things like architecture or some of the fields that you were mentioning earlier, I mean, the engineering and others, that we think of the output, but underneath all of those things, there's sort of an operating system, a set of principles, a set of methods, a set of approaches, mindsets even, that are shared. And that's what we're really trying to grapple with when we try to describe what design thinking is, so that we can take that same operating system, that same tool set, if you like, and apply it to things that perhaps that hasn't been applied to before. And the reason I'm so passionate about that is because I think we're at a moment that perhaps we've not seen before, a moment of enormous transition in the world, a moment of enormous kind of volatility and uncertainty, if you like, where many of the systems that actually emerged from the industrial revolution are proving to be somewhat unsustainable, right, and or uncertain, whether it's our financial systems, our global climate, our education systems, our healthcare systems, our transportation infrastructure. I mean, the list gets longer and longer of things that seem to have been built to serve a certain set of needs that are not seemingly quite fit for purpose today. And so there's an opportunity to rethink those. And I think we need kind of every tool we can find, including design thinking, to search for new solutions.
And, I think the great thing about this shift from design to design thinking is it's so much more inclusive, right? Tim is classically trained as an industrial designer, and so he is perfectly comfortable in the world of design. And I come more from the world of business, where, in the business community, there are people who say, they're pretty sure they're never going to be a designer. Whereas they can be a design thinker, anybody can be a design thinker. And so I think it's more of a kind of an open architecture. And therein lies the ability to involve more people, engage more people in a program for change if you use the tools of design thinking.
And so you came out with your book this year, Creative Confidence. Sure. And in that book, you talk about how, in some ways, the concepts of creative confidence even transcend design thinking, or that are the meta concepts
Sure.
that everybody should understand.
Yeah, it's not instead of, but I think it kind of builds on design thinking in the sense that, the principles of design thinking are pretty simple. You start with empathy. You always start with humans. You use prototyping and experimentation as the way to learn, and through even failures you learn. And then when you come up with solutions that you think might be useful to the world, you use the power of storytelling to bring them out there. And so that's very easy to say. And it takes work and practice to be good at it. And what we found, and it didn't really seek out this topic of creative competence, what we found is, interviewing 100 people who we think achieved it, is that when they went beyond intellectually understanding the principles of design thinking, when they got to viscerally understanding, to embracing it, to thinking of it as the way they address problems and issues in the world, then they reach this. If you could think of design thinking as kind of a tool set, that would be one way to think of it. Creative competence is kind of the mindset, is this mental state that says, first of all, I am creative. By my kind of new definition of creativity, I am creative, and these are the tools that I use to apply my creativity to solving problems in the world.
And in your experience, do people have a hard time, actually living by these principles? It's one thing to sort of talk about not being fearful of experimenting or the like, but is it a completely different thing to get people to actually embrace these different ways of thinking?
Well, is it hard? I mean, there is, the tools require practice to get better at, but is it hard in the kind of living at it? No, it's like joyful. I mean, it's really empowering to say, here's a problem, and it's a really hard problem, and I don't see the solution yet, but I'm confident that I have a process, that I have tools that will help me, almost always in a team, that will help us work towards a solution. And that's kind of a wonderful feeling. When you interview these people, they glow. I mean, they are excited by their work, and not everybody has that.
Once they've achieved it. I mean,
once they've achieved it, yes.
The challenge, I think, is that dissonance, if you like, between the kind of intellectual understanding of the concept and overcoming, if you like, the fear of actually acting on those concepts, or the uncertainty. I mean, we've historically had a very hard time convincing people who are skeptical of design thinking just through explaining it to them. I mean, it doesn't work, to be honest with you. It doesn't matter how hard you try. And yet, that number of times that I've seen people who are deeply skeptical go through the experience and be transformed through going through the experience. And some of it's because it does challenge some of our sort of fundamental assumptions, particularly about the way we've set the world up today. I don't think they're necessarily fundamental constraints to us as human beings, but we sort of set the world up, particularly in the world of business, to assume that most of what we do is based on already knowing the answer, right? And indeed, we've unfortunately set up a lot of our education system around the same concept, right? That most of what we do is already based on the assumption we already know the answer, and it's about making the right choice amongst the available set of answers that might already be out there. And yet, when you go into a creative process, you have to be comfortable with uncertainty, with not knowing what that solution is going to be, right? So you have to have so much of this confidence is they're willing to launch into a process without knowing what the end of that process is going to look like, right? And once you get comfortable with that, it's easy. It is easy. I mean, I assume it's the same thing for people who like to jump out of planes with parachutes attached to their backs. Nothing on this earth would get me to do that, but I assume those people get to the point where they're comfortable with the knowledge that that parachute will open and they will get to the ground safely. Well, it's something a bit like that, when you're embarking on a creative process, is that you're comfortable with knowing that you have the tools available, that you will get to an answer, even though you have no idea what it's going to be when you start. And in business, that's a very scary idea. Right? I mean, if you think about how often you might be challenged in a business context to justify that you're going to go do this thing by telling me that you already know what's going to happen. Right? I mean, that's a daily occurrence in business. So it does challenge that somewhat, and that can be a difficult thing to get over.
Can people, go from business to being successful at IDEO, or does the experience of a career in business almost preclude that?
Well, I mean, I think to drastically oversimplify business. I mean, there are two faces of business, right? At least the way I think we tend to run businesses today. The dominant side of business, if you like, is the side of optimization and driving for efficiency. But most businesses have some element of innovation associated with them, and many have a lot. And almost all entrepreneurs have a huge dose of the kind of the creative side of business, the side that's searching for innovation, the side that's searching for new choices. We have many people that come out of business and come into IDEO and very successful, but it's because they tend to come from the side of innovation, perhaps, rather than optimization.
So the sort of mythical designer is a person working alone that's sort of has great and fluid ideas that expresses himself in either designs of buildings or objects or the like, and yet a lot of what you talk about in design thinking and creative competence and the like is really design as a team activity. Does the lone designer make sense anymore, or is that a thing of the past?
Did the lone inventor ever exist? I'm not positive they did. We're not far from Edison, New Jersey, or what formerly known as Menlo Park, right? And so Thomas Edison, most prolific inventor in the history of America, right? in the story of Edison, it tends to underplay all those smart people working with him in the labs in Menlo Park. In fact, they interviewed one of the, I think it was the head of his lab, and he said, yes, Edison, he said, a collective verb, I mean a collective noun, as in Edison invented the phonograph. You know, imagine if you're him and you spent like hundreds of hours working on that thing, and then there's Edison, you know. And so I think there's a lot of mythology even to those lone inventors from the past. And the stuff we work on today, I mean, we were just in the creativity class, so we have this really bright group of students working on stuff. You know, you're not going to go off in the room if you're the brightest person in the world. The solution doesn't lend itself to that. You have to involve, in this case, you know, the administration at Princeton and the people, you know, running a service, and the, you know, there's a constellation of people that are going to be part of the solution. And what you found is if you do the whole work in the back, you're the lone genius in the back room, and you say, here's my brilliant idea that's going to change all of your lives, and you all have to help now, good luck getting that implemented.
Tim, I think your book, you make a distinction between teams that are multidisciplinary and those that are interdisciplinary, and almost a distinction between teams that work effectively and teams that don't work effectively.
Well, I mean, when it comes to innovation, yeah. I mean, I think the you know, the historically we first started well, with some really interesting exceptions, things like the Manhattan Project, which was truly interdisciplinary. Most multidisciplinary or teams where we brought people from different backgrounds together tended to be teams that were trying to actually make decisions rather than do stuff. So there were standard-setting teams and things like that historically. And what we found in our work anyway, that when you want a team to be creative, that if the context is, let's say you have 4 different disciplines, you have an engineer and a designer and maybe a social scientist and maybe a business person, and they take what I would describe in the book as a multidisciplinary approach. Essentially, all they're interested in doing is representing their own discipline, and so the result becomes a negotiation between those 4 disciplines. Each only works on things to do with their own discipline and represents their own discipline. And I think that fails that does not result in the most interesting ideas. I think what happens in an interdisciplinary team is really what happens because of the types of people that you have in that group who are able to do more than just represent their discipline. They are both empathic to the ideas and perspectives and points of view of other disciplines. And indeed, the best of them are able even to play a role within those other disciplines or some number of those other disciplines. There might be an engineer who's passionate about people and has spent lots of time out in the world observing people and can actually have a point of view about what the needs might be. Or it might be a business person that loves prototyping and therefore can help realize an idea. And so it's the, I stole a term that I think I've seen, well, many have claimed original authorship for, but there's this idea of T-shaped people. And the reason I think it's a nice term, even though it's a little limiting, is that it represents this idea that people can be both, if you like, technically deep within a certain discipline, but also have breadth that allows them to productively engage, both with the world in general and with other disciplines. And when you get those kinds of people working together, magic really does happen. So that's how I would distinguish between interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. The disciplines may be just exactly the same in both circumstances, but the people and the way they think about those disciplines and the way they engage, that's different.
How do you look for those people choosing who comes to work for IDEO?
Well, I mean, this is one of the most important things in a firm like IDEO, or really any enterprise, is getting the right people. In the end, it's the most important thing, because if you can get the most talented people, or if you can get more talented, more energetic, more creative people than competitors in your space do, game over, right? And so I think part of it is we just take the hiring process really seriously. We try to be quick at most things, and we're slow at this. We put extra care into it because we know that that's the beginning of what, in most cases, a very long relationship, and we want to get that right. And so it comes out in interviews. We have lots of people talk to the person. Sometimes we have them actually work on a little project. We create a project to see how people think and work on things.
We also tend to hire for values as much as we hire for technical competence. I mean, it's relatively easy to decide what somebody's technical competence is, and we're fortunate. There are lots of very smart people in the world who seem to be attracted to working in our kind of environment. So what we like to do is really trying to hire for values or cultural fit, I suppose you could call it. And some of those are very much about this idea of being interdisciplinary. We look for people, for instance, that understand how to make other people successful as well as themselves. And you can filter for that in the way that they represent their ideas and the way they represent the other people that they've worked with, the way they talk about their ideas or the way they interact with people. You can filter for that. But it's an example of something that's been tremendously. It's been a sort of a. I like to think of it as one of the kind of secret superpowers at IDEO is that the amount of work people do to actually help other people do their work. It doesn't really matter how technically brilliant somebody is. If they're not willing to engage in that way, they probably won't be very useful at IDEO.
So what advice would you give to a Princeton student that aspires to having a career in design and doing...
Go take your class. I mean, it's easy, right? Go take your class. I think that at least as a first, as a first step. I mean, the thing that I sort of on the one hand, wish I could wind the clock back and go do my career again, starting from here, is because I think the opportunities to apply creative thinking, design thinking to interesting problems that matter have never been greater than they are today. And so the sort of choice is just tremendously exciting, and so acquiring some of those tools, building up one's creative confidence, the willingness to experiment and learn through failure and go off into the fog without knowing what the end result's going to be. Those are all things that you can start to build while you're a student, even if there aren't formal design classes. I mean, at Princeton you don't have a design school. You go study architecture, or you can go and do classes like yours. But you can apply some of that thinking to any class, right? I mean, you can apply that kind of creative mindset to any class, certainly one that's got some opportunity to do something kind of tangible at the end of it, and the thing that's project driven or whatever. So I would encourage students just to begin to acquire those skills. Design's also something that I think more and more is something that you can where you can take a set of skills that you might have and knowledge that you've acquired doing whatever you study, and then go take that to design later. One of the things I love about this country actually is that that's much more possible to do than where I grew up. I mean, in Europe, it's still relatively hard to take the kind of true liberal arts approach, with just a couple of exceptions. And there are very few places that really offer what you offer here at this institution, or many institutions in the States. And there are very few graduate programs over there that are designed for people that haven't already studied being a designer. Where I did my graduate program, if you hadn't already done 4 or 5 years of design, there wasn't much chance you were going to be able to go there. Now they have started programs there now that are more designed for that. But there are many of those kinds of programs here. So it's possible to take a degree from any other, an undergraduate degree from anywhere, and go apply to Stanford or any number of other institutions that have got graduate design degrees if you want to go that route.
a specific suggestion I would make for people wanting to pursue a career in design is to work on your storytelling skills. We were actually late to the party on this. In the early days of the firm, going back 30 years, we thought that the work should speak for itself. And that was true on the design side, it was true on the technical side, like, isn't it beautiful or isn't it technically elegant? We just thought, it's obvious, if you can't see it, you're stupid. At some level, people are thinking that, right? And now we realize that the work doesn't speak for itself. It is your job. It is a part of your responsibility. If you want to make changes in the world, it's part of your responsibility to take your idea, whether it's in physical form or not, to take your idea and bring it to life. And the way that happens is through storytelling, and it's storytelling writ large. It's using digital media, it's using video, it's using the force of your own personality. So you've got to take that idea and think about the listener and put it into the terms that the listener will understand and hear and hopefully act upon.
One piece of advice I would give to anybody that wants to follow a creative career is forget the idea that your resume is really going to be the thing that gets you the opportunity. Right? I never look at resumes. Never. Sorry for those of you that have sent resumes. But I absolutely look at stories people tell about their lives. I absolutely look at portfolios that people share of the creative experiences that they've had. And they are essentially resumes, but they're ones I can actually tell something from. I think we've sort of defaulted to this kind of standardized mechanism for describing ourselves that we think works for all kinds of situations in business, and it just doesn't. A resume is great as a list of institutions you've been to, but that's about all it does.
If the employer went to Princeton, then that's a big
that helps.
That makes a big difference.
But there are other ways of achieving that. You actually don't even need a resume for that. But think about the way that you want to tell the story of who you are and what you do. And the reason I encourage students to think about this idea of portfolio is that a portfolio is a collection of things you've actually done in the world, right? And I don't care what it is. It could be photographs you've taken about the world that you care about. It can be projects you've done as part of classes. It can be creative things you've done out of classes. Whatever it is, it's a history of your development as a creative person. And that could be just as true for somebody who's technically creative. So, a portfolio is just as valuable for an engineer as it is for a designer or an artist. But it's a collection of the experiences you've had, and you can speak to those and how you've learned through those experiences. And it's so much more valuable when you're trying to understand what somebody's able to do. And then you combine that with the way you tell the story about yourself as a person and your life, and you have a pretty amazing package. One of the things that stuns me about people who come to IDEO is the variety of ways in which they tell the stories about themselves. We have this what has become actually a very, very high stakes game at IDEO, which is every new employee, sometime within the first 2 or 3 weeks of their arrival, is supposed to send out an email to the whole firm with their introduction to the firm, right? And it's got to be seriously high stakes these days. The quality of infographics and video and amazing storytelling, and never mind the amazing lives some of these people have had before they get to IDEO. It makes me think that I wouldn't have got into this company in a million years if I was applying today. But at the same time, it's wonderful, right? Because suddenly you've got 600 colleagues who understand you at a completely different level, and so the really smart ones figure out how to make that part of their application to IDEO in the first place, rather than waiting for it to already be there. And so I think Tom's absolutely right. Storytelling is a skill that's not just valuable for you in terms of expressing your ideas, but it's tremendously valuable as a skill for expressing yourself.
So speaking of high-stakes storytelling and alternative to a resume, my favorite interview in the history of IDEO was this young designer, Bo Bergeron, shows up in our Chicago office, and somehow it leaked what was going to happen, or he asked for 2 projectors or something, and so the whole office shows up. And Bo, no resume at all, Bo projects his life story onto his white T-shirt that he's wearing that day. You can see the YouTube video, Bo Bergeron, and tells his story in this very animated way and got hired on the spot. So, yeah, you never know.
So it is, with design thinking being such a powerful system of thinking, is this something that should be considered to be part of the liberal arts education?
I mean, when you mentioned that the other day when we were talking on the phone, and I hadn't really thought about it quite that way before, but I think you might. I mean, and I don't want to be overly arrogant about making claims for design, but I think I think if you consider it as an operating system or a system of thinking that can be broadly applied to sort of almost any situation, then it feels to me that's what liberal arts educations are all about, or liberal arts are all about. They are the fundamental systems of thinking that we have: scientific method, critical thinking, narrative thinking, whatever the set is that you choose to describe, that can be applied in almost any context, and therefore is a sort of a set of capabilities that we can have as human beings that give us enormous adaptability as we go forward in the world. That, let's face it, the sort of conventional skills are becoming obsolete at a frightening pace. And so, I think that if it's substantively different enough from the other kind of strands of liberal arts, and I'm not sure I'm the right person to know that, but if it is, then I think you might legitimately consider it that way. In which case, it would be exciting to think that one day it might be taught in liberal arts colleges and universities around the world. It would be very cool.
As a liberal arts grad myself, I love the idea that it could be raised up. I think not at the top level. There's philosophy and there's mathematics. I don't think it's there. It's like a tier down or something. But if you think about what liberal arts were, I mean, the concept of liberal arts is these are the skills, or this is the knowledge that helps you be a good citizen of the world, right? And so as I have this lovely experience now where I come into work every day and read emails from people who read the latest book, and they're talking about how they use design thinking to literally, and they use the term "changed my life." And so it is not business people. I mean, there's a business person comes in, but it is these citizens of the world. It's a phys ed teacher in Nanjing, China. It's an engineer in South Korea. It's actually a housewife here in Princeton, New Jersey. Told me her story about how she got creative confidence and how she started her own blog and things like that. And so it's definitely not a narrow topic anymore. It's broad, and it would be lovely to think of it as the kind of thing that would be called a liberal art.
So the design thinking sort of starts with and emphasizes empathy for the users and the like. And that becomes a thread that goes through all the different steps of the process. And yet, sort of classical design had aesthetics that sort of was the point of departure and sort of connected all the design dots. How does aesthetics play into design thinking, or does it?
Oh, it absolutely does. But I think that in many ways aesthetics is a sort of a refined shorthand for the idea of empathy, actually, because what the visual formal world does is it connects to us as human beings at an emotional and an intuitive level, right? It changes our perspective on things, it gives us understanding, it causes us to respond to things. And so designers and artists, architects, poets, composers that use, if you like, aesthetic form in whatever their medium might be to connect to people can only do that if they're deeply empathic for the people that they're trying to connect to. Right? You write a piece of music that gets right into people unless you understand that, somehow have some feeling for those people you're trying to get right into. You can't make a painting that, captures the wonder of people unless you've got some feeling for that person that you're capturing the wonder of. And so I've always believed that aesthetics, that we've refined over thousands of years, not just a couple of hundred years. Really, it's a sort of it is a sort of shorthand for empathy, a way that we've learned to express empathy as a species. I think that we're constantly discovering new ways of doing that, often as we get new technologies, if you like, that allow us to explore the relationship between human beings and the world. We have ways of doing that today that were very hard to do a few hundred years ago. I think of film and now digital media, and soon we'll be wiring straight into people's brains, and that will be a whole new world of aesthetics at that point. But I think there's a strong connection between aesthetics and empathy. I think where it kind of goes wrong is when it starts leaching into style, right? And it's a very gray line between the two. And I don't mean to sort of denigrate the word style. I love style, I think. But I think that there's a version of style, and the classic kind of discipline where one might be critical of this is the auto industry in the sort of 50s, 60s, and 70s, right? Where in America, where cars, automobiles were styled, where the aesthetics were this sort of abstract language that was marketing language rather than a language based on real empathy for people. Now, I believe that automobile design at its best absolutely connects to people in very emotional ways. But it lost track of that, and you saw an industry get further and further away from understanding the people that it was really serving, and the style of those vehicles became less and less meaningful to people, and ultimately to the point where the whole industry lost its way, and is now fighting hard to try and find its way back. And so I think there's a version of aesthetics that's sort of, you might describe as sort of cynically market-driven, that actually isn't based on real empathy. And that's a very dangerous path to follow, I think. There are many industries and many companies that make a lot of money doing that, but I think it's dangerous.
Steve Jobs is famously quoted as saying, he wouldn't want to ask somebody about what they needed because they wouldn't know. And he says that his not asking made his, the designs that came out of Apple better. Is that true, or is that?
Well, for starters, we have strong connection to Steve when he was live, and you don't necessarily want to use Steve as your role model in a lot of ways. We shouldn't all try to follow exactly in his footsteps. But there's an element of truth there. There's a part of that we would agree with, which is people can't always articulate their needs. And so we think that sending somebody a survey saying, well, what do you need that you don't have? Good luck. You'll get responses, but it may have nothing to do with reality, right? And so when we do the anthropology, when we're trying to build empathy people, it's not all question-based. We're observing. Because people have very, very unconscious needs. People have developed workarounds that they're not even conscious of. And so you're not looking at what's bugging them or what do they say they need, but what are the latent needs? What are the things that are out there? And especially if you're going to make a big technological leap, big technological leap in our future, automated cars, self-driving cars. Well, people can't articulate all the needs they have about that. But if you give them a prototype and let them drive it around, then you'll see really quickly, oh my God, oh, we need this. Oh, and we don't need valet parking anymore either. And so, yeah, that part that you can't always ask them. You can, if you ask, they'll say, can I have this a little smaller next year? Can I have it a little cheaper? You know, can I have it in blue, right? That kind of question they can answer, but that doesn't help you with the breakthroughs.
But I think, wasn't it Henry Ford that was quoted as saying, if I'd asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. And you know, the solution that much of Silicon Valley uses, including Apple, is they pick problems where they can design for themselves, right? So a lot of it's to do with the problem you pick, right? So, I mean, Apple, I think, has done a wonderful job. Steve did a wonderful job of picking things where he could essentially design for himself, or at least have a high degree of intuition for what the end result could be, right? And you know, where you can do, I think that's a good bet. I mean, if you're wanting to be an entrepreneur and design things that are really disruptive, I think a pretty good bet is to try and figure out a problem, pick a problem where you can design for yourself. It's one of the reasons why surgeons often come up with great ideas for new surgical tools, right? They're designing for themselves. So that does take care of some set of the world's innovation kind of opportunity set, but it's not all of it, right? And so there are many problems where it's either impossible for people to design for themselves because it's too complex, or where the problem is such that the ones best equipped to solve it are not the end users of that system. Right? Hard to ask kindergartners to design their own education system, for instance. Although actually they can make quite an interesting contribution. So we've got this significant problem set for which you can't design for yourself, and therefore finding techniques for building empathy is the alternative to that. Right? And so whether it's the sort of anthropological, kind of ethnographic kinds of research that we do, or whatever mechanisms people wish to use, we need to find a way of replacing that advantage of designing for ourselves.
So recently you did some very interesting studies that you call Made in the Future, where you're envisioning how products and services and things in our lives will be different you're postulating a fairly near-term future. And some of those are just fascinating, ideas. And I was wondering, maybe if each of you could share your favorite or your favorite two.
You spend any time on the site? You don't
I have the
advantage.
Do I know what they are?
I have the advantage of having done the project,
yes.
So I actually do know some of it.
So, yeah,
I'll let you go first, and you can pick what you like.
Sure. No, Made in the Future. So we do this from time to time where we're just kind of thinking out loud in front of everybody, and they're not fully formed ideas in a way. But we did a really fun one with the Future of the Book a few years ago, where we mapped out 3 possibilities where digital books intersect with physical books and how they could be different. And so this latest one, I think, is just out in the last month or so, and pick my favorite. Let me think. So there's one. The most visual to me is the one in which you have a conversation. So I think you'd only use this in high stakes conversations, but in which you have a 3D printer that is listening to your conversation, say with a loved one or like with a group of your best friends out, and it is. Using some dimension, some metric not fully explained, it is graphing in 3D space the emotion of your conversation. And what you end up with is a sculpture that is supposed to be, like I said, if it was a high stakes conversation, imagine like your bachelor party or something like that, you end up with a physical representation of the conversation you just had with your friends.
Yeah, no, I like that one a lot. I mean, we sometimes we like to try and kind of get out ahead a little bit of the questions that companies and clients are coming to ask us, and we're also very fortunate we get to hang out with people at many interesting academic institutions around the world who are busy figuring out what the future is really going to be because they're inventing the technologies to do it. And we spent a lot of time at the Media Lab and at MIT, and a lot of the technologies that we were using in those scenarios were technologies coming out of the Media Lab and other parts of MIT. And we had a lot of fun, actually. I went and launched Made in the Future at South by Southwest a month ago, and Joey Ito, who runs the media lab, and myself got to be on stage kind of talking about some of these videos. It was great. And I really, as we dug into this, what we're interested in, as designers, making is tremendously important to us, because one definition of design is that you make the intangible tangible, right? That you take an abstract idea and make it real, right? And and if it's a physical thing, something you literally drop on the floor and it makes a thump when it hits the floor. And another definition of design that I quite like, which is what design does. It grabs hold of the future and brings it to the present. Right? Because what it can do is think about what might be and then go build it. Right? And I think when we're at moments where technologies are potentially disrupting the way the world's going to be, it's really interesting to try and do that. Right? 99% of the time you're wrong, but it's still really interesting to do. And I think we're at one of those moments with the way we make things in the world. I think we're as exciting as the information revolution is, I think we're at a tremendously exciting moment where we are potentially replacing some amount of, and certainly not all of by any means, but some amount of the approach we've had to manufacturing that's essentially based on heat, beat, and treat, right? The sort of the technologies of the Industrial Revolution. And I was taught as a designer, as an industrial designer, that my job was to figure out how to design something and then go make 1 million of them, right? I mean, that was what I was taught how to do. And that's what those technologies allowed us to do, right? We're now at a moment with additive manufacturing and the ability to embed data and information in the physical world and move information backwards and forwards between the physical and digital world sort of seamlessly. We're at a moment where we can think differently about the way we make things. And so actually one of my favorite concepts out of Made in the Future was, it's almost like a throwback to the past, which is, I think with additive manufacturing, what we might find is huge amounts of bespoke manufacturing going on in the future. So one of the ideas in there, that we call them trailer towns, but it's this idea that there might be groups of artisanal manufacturers that can move around the world, move around the countryside. They might visit your town, and you might be wanting to create a new kitchen. And what would get shipped in from the world of today's manufacturing would be the infrastructure, the subsystems. But what they would create would be the user experience for that. Maybe it's the kitchen cabinet carcasses come from IKEA, but everything you touch gets made for you by those artisanal manufacturers literally in your home when you need it. And with additive manufacturing, we will be able to do those kinds of things and many other things which are even more interesting. And so I think it's fascinating. One of the things that we're seeing that already with these new ways of manufacturing. Not only are we seeing the time from idea to product, or at least prototype, being collapsed rapidly, but we're seeing entrepreneurial opportunities for designers to go make stuff in the world and make businesses that didn't exist before. So yeah, if you're interested in exploring the ideas, then I think it's madeinthefuture.com. But it's
yeah, maybe if you're like a history major at Princeton, this idea of 3D printing just seems like a geeky thing that shows up on the cover of Popular Science or something. But this is like going to change how we relate to the physical world. I think when our book launched in Silicon Valley, we only had time for 5 questions at this book signing event, and 3 of the questions were about 3D printing. And I just saw the head of Hyatt Hotels, who was actually the lead investor, the family members that used to own Hyatt, and he talked for an hour about their hotel business. And then he said, and now I want to talk about the future. And I'm thinking, what's he going to say next? I thought he meant the future of hotels. No, he spent the next 10 minutes talking about 3D printing. Right? And so when the head of Hyatt Hotels, and he's only got one topic about the future, talks about that, it definitely got my attention, like, uh-oh, better.
Well, we've all read these science fiction stories about, being able to print, breakfast Well, I mean, we're now buying 3D food printers, and we're using them for prototyping and for trying out, new food combinations and all kinds of weird stuff. So, I mean, Star Trek's coming faster and faster, right? It's cool.
I want to leave some time for questions from the audience, and because we have a lot of people here, and yes. Come on down and, yeah.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for coming here. I'm a senior in the computer science department here, and one of the questions I had was, we talked a lot about, even today, how design is sort of like a team effort, but at the same time, design and aesthetics is also really subjective. So how do you sort of reconcile, when you're working with a team, different people's ideas and create something in the end that's acceptable to everyone?
That's actually a really good question. And despite all the Q&A panels I've done about design before, nobody's actually asked that question. But it's a really, it's kind of, I don't know how it works. What tends to happen in our own teams is that there is that moment where individual authorship still matters, right? And so what we see, I think if I was to kind of observe what happens, it tends to be that when you're working at the conceptual level, then the team works collectively, and then as you get to those moments of expression, the team tends to kind of like break up into its individual components, and so that might be the moment when the industrial designer decides what the product's going to look like, or the graphic designer decides how we're going to tell the story. But there's still an awful lot of argument and debate amongst the team about whether that's really the right way to do it. But somebody actually has that moment that kind of controls that moment of authorship. And I think it tends to be a sort of a backwards and forwards kind of dialogue between the individuals and the team. A team that works really well is one that is able to work collectively together and then argue really fiercely with each other about whether they've got the right idea or not. And that requires a lot of trust. And we didn't really talk about it so much already, but I think one of the most kind of fundamental base level sort of cultural values that you've got to create in a creative and collaborative organization is one of trust. Not trust that everybody's always right, but trust that you can argue with each other, you can make mistakes, that you can fail and still collaborate and still work together. And so establishing that sense of trust is really important.
And the only thing I'd add to that is if you've got two competing ideas and you can quickly, cheaply bring them both to life, then you can show them to whoever the important audience is. Often it's the client or the customer or something like that. And the problem, the reason that that there's that creative abrasion happening is both people think they're right. Right? And so I'm as susceptible to this as anybody. We worked with, when it was still a one-man company, we worked with this company that is now called Coinstar, right? That, you take your coins to the supermarket. And there was something I was darn sure I was right about. I was sure that when people take their coffee can full of coins, they take them to the supermarket, that they would have an idea in their head of how much money it was. Like, I bet I got $300 worth of coins in there, right? But they don't, right? They got $72.89 in there, but they got this weird idea. And so I was sure that we had to build the prototype, and we did. We built 5 prototypes. It's fairly expensive, to hold the coins halfway down. Coins go in the top, they get counted and sorted, and they're held here, halfway down on what we call the escrow table, so that we could say, you got $72.89, okay? And then pressing that yes button was their agreement that, like, no disputes here, we're not gonna sue you, that's just gonna work, right? I'm positive I'm right. I know, my intuition about human nature says we gotta do this. Added a lot of expense, added a lot of complexity to the mechanical device, whatever. We built 5, we put them in Safeway stores for 6 weeks, 24 hours a day for 6 weeks, and guess what? Nobody ever pressed that no button. You bring that coffee can in and put it in a Safeway store, you never want to see those coins again, right? But I'd have gone to the mat. I'd have argued forever that I was right, except that we could afford to prototype it, show to the people who mattered, who were the customers, and then it's like, I am so totally wrong. I'm willing to do. So I'm not like still clinging to it. I'm not griping about people don't listen to me. I'm thinking, man, I was wrong. And so if you can prototype it, then it's not even begrudging giving in. It's like, oh yeah, never mind that idea, right? And so when you can, that's great.
Thank you.
Great. Well, we'll do here, and then we'll.
I got to the mic first. Have you tried anything where you use one of your teams or more than one with actual crowdsourcing? And how do you manage that? Will you really give them that experience?
Yeah, we actually run a crowdsourcing design platform, which any of you can go and become part of if you want. It's called OpenIDEO, so openideo.com. I think it's got about 60,000 people in the community right now. And we set social innovation challenges. It's very carefully designed to be non-competitive. In other words, nobody gets to keep the IP. There are no prizes at the end. And we get really interesting ideas and lots of collaboration. We manage it as a community, and we're setting a series of challenges right now. I think the one that's on there at the moment, we're working with the UK aid agency around creating safe spaces for women and girls in urban areas. And we're getting we get a lot of great research, we get a lot of great ideas, we've been surprised actually about how effective the collaboration has been on the platform. You still often need small teams to help synthesize and help move the process along, and we have designers who act as community managers. We were talking about this topic a little earlier, to help move the community along. But we've been excited about the success of the platform, and we're now actually making that platform available to individual organizations and institutions. So Harvard started using it for their business school alumni, and the Knight Foundation use it to set their challenges as well now. But we've yet to see, we've been running this for about 3 years now. We've done 25 challenges, I think. We've seen some great impact out in the world. People have started new businesses with the ideas that have come off the platform.
In one case, we literally saved lives. We did the bone marrow transplant one, where there's individuals who say they got a transplant because of this.
So we're seeing impact. I don't think we're seeing what I would call massively disruptive breakthrough ideas coming off the platform. And there may be, too early to say, but there may be some relationship between kind of how a crowd works and it could just be because it's very public and open, and and people aren't willing to put their disruptive ideas up there. I don't know, but it could be there's a relationship between how crowds work and how disruptive the ideas are. I don't know. It's a bit early to say, but we're also, by the way, seeing a number of institutions use the platform as a teaching tool for people that want to explore design thinking. So maybe you could try that out.
And it doesn't always have to be a breakthrough idea. A global airline used this system to ask the flight attendants this pretty darn basic question, which is, when you served the meal today, which did you run out of, chicken or beef? Actually, right? The flight attendants know the answer to that story.
Well, actually, that's almost right.
Okay.
They actually asked them to predict.
Oh, to predict.
They predicted
yes.
it. So this is one of those interesting kind of behavioral economic stories, I suppose. This airline would decide a month in advance what the split was going to be between fish, or chicken, beef, and the veggie option, or whatever these things normally are. And they decided a month in advance. They had massive amounts of wastage. They often got it wrong. So they never asked the flight attendants, of course. So as part of this platform, we built this clever little widget tool thing that allowed they'd put up the menu options, and then they'd ask the flight attendants to predict what do you think the choice was. They saved 10% of their food costs instantly. Because the flight attendants actually knew what the passengers were going to choose, unlike the people sat at head office who were designing the food. So, yeah.
You have a question?
So I was wondering if you guys might say something about how you see design thinking in education, like K-12, and if you might say something about especially how kids deal with kind of critiquing and feedback phases. And the reason that I ask about that specifically is that I've done some observations and worked with kids doing design thinking courses in middle school levels. And I often see that the kids are not willing to, are not wanting to own their critiques. So they tell the teacher or me or someone or send an email, opposed to having a really dynamic conversation at their table.
Sure, so K-12, big initiative for us. We're trying to reinvent the school system, for example, for the nation of Peru. We're designing and building, like we hope to do 200 schools. So we've designed, it's a charter school system. We've designed the curriculum, the business model, the buildings themselves. So we're really interested in how design thinking plays out in school. We're curating, let's say hosting a site called designthinkinginschools.org.
I think it's designthinkingforeducators.org.
No, that's the tool set.
Oh, I'm sorry. And
so there's,
you know what's something I don't know about.
So yeah, there is a tool set that's free and available to all teachers, and it's called Design Thinking for Educators. If you can get that through the IDEO site, I'm sure. But then, no, the Sandy Spiker, or the heads of our education initiative, she put together this thing called, I'm pretty sure it's designthinkinginschools.org. And what it is a collection of all the current design thinking oriented programs all over America and the world. And there's a lot. We're not reviewing and evaluating, right? People are self-nominating because we didn't want to get in the business of, let's say, accrediting design thinking programs. That's not a business we want to be in. And so lots of things going on. And then as far as evaluation, so I have to say I personally not deeply involved in the K through 12 thing. Oh, K through 12, we did this really fun program about school lunch program, but I think it's not directly topical to your question. So evaluation, all I can say is not specifically to K through 12, but we are experimenting with this, this feedback process called I Like, I Wish. Because what happens is, people don't always hear your feedback when you say that the kids don't own it. You know, it's hard. You have to get past their defenses to get them to hear if you want to have any hope of them actually changing behavior. And so the I Like, I Wish structure starts with the positive and states both sides as an opinion, not like you should stop doing this, or, you know, it's not like talking down to someone. You know, I like that you've done this, or I like that you've considered this, I like that you did this way. And then the next phase is I wish. You know, I wish you'd come up with a solution that, you know, that could be implemented in the next month. I wish that, and so it's a kind of a neutral evaluation thing in which you're not judging them, you're just you know, pointing them to directions they may not have gone. And so with experimenting with it, we found that it gets past the defensiveness, and it's like, yeah, well, maybe I should do that. And so it's a tool.
Building on that, I would say that I think that prototypes are a great way of objectifying criticism. And so, I mean, even in design schools, where, you know, theoretically, you know, you'd have thought design students would be relatively good at critique, and it turns out, for the most part, they're not, unless you've got often great professors that actually enable great critique to happen. People aren't actually, there's something socially uncomfortable about offering criticism when you're about to stand up and share your idea. It's like, am I really going to criticize this person because they're about to come and criticize me? I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense socially when you think about it. So it's an uncomfortable situation. But particularly when it's largely opinion-based. And so if you can get beyond the idea to some kind of evidence through prototype, you know, I built something and it worked or it didn't work, or it worked this way, or it might have worked that way, or I found this stuff out, then I think there's the opportunity for criticism to be a little bit more, well, it's not criticism at that point, it's a discussion about what happened. And I think you can sort of objectify criticism a little bit more easily when you've got a prototype. So I think framing up design problems where it's possible for the kids to actually make something that they tried out, that gives them some feedback, because of the kind of, I mean, the lovely thing about prototypes is they use the real world to deliver the feedback rather than just other people. So I would at least consider that as a possible approach.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm a sophomore, recently declared in comparative literature. And I had 2 questions for the both of you. The first kind of relates to the technical aspects of design. So I'm interested in possibly pursuing a career in industrial design after graduation, but while Princeton does prepare us in a very great liberal arts education, we don't get the technical training that one would at an art or design undergrad school. So any recommendations for getting the concrete experiences and portfolio items for that kind of career? And then the second question related to the 3D printing idea. And this was a question I actually asked someone who works at Continuum as an industrial designer, which is, while 3D design, 3D printing certainly looks like it's about to revolutionize kind of like every field, right? But it also might make I've heard people say it might make obsolete certain parts of design. Like, for example, if someone can just, download from the internet a template of a stapler, why do they need, like a professional industrial designer to design that stapler? So kind of your thoughts on both of those questions.
Those are questions. The first one's for you.
The technical bit? Yeah, I mean, there are, it is hard, right? I mean, I would say that that what you need, if you want to enter a career as an industrial designer, at some point you're probably going to have to go study industrial design. And I think, but there are graduate programs available to do that for people that haven't studied undergraduate industrial design. I would say that in order to prepare yourself for that, the things that I think Tom was mentioning earlier, I mean, your ability to express yourself other than verbally. So particularly visually, to express ideas visually or in 3 dimensions, showing evidence of that and having confidence in your ability to do that. At the simplest, you could just think of that as your ability to draw. But there are many ways that you can express ideas kind of visually and tangibly in the world. So that's something you would need to work on. And I think getting used to or trying to put yourself in the situation of this sort of project experience. I mean, really the way that people create stuff in the design world is you start with a question and you end up hopefully with some workable solution. And you can think of that as a project. It takes a finite amount of time. We can talk at some other point about how that's changing perhaps with some of these new manufacturing approaches. But you think of it as a finite block of time. So try and do as many of those kinds of projects, whether they're personal ones or you can find yourself in a situation where you can do as many of those projects as you can, because each of those iterations you learn about the whole process of what a good design question looks like, what good insights look like, what good prototypes look like, what a good story looks like, and you just get better and better at it. So that would be my advice. There are a number of institutions around the country, that design schools that sort of run kind of further education, kind of continuing education programs that help people build their portfolios that want to go into a career. We've had a number of people that have come to IDEA with degrees in history and economics and as hardcore designers, because they went and did, they built their portfolio by going to RISD or Rhode Island School of Design, or Art Center in LA or whatever, and then went and did a graduate program and ended up as hardcore designers. So it's certainly possible to do.
I'll handle the 3D question, which is, this is a very, very disruptive technology. And so whenever that happens, there will be winners and losers. And so yes, some roles will go away, some jobs will go away. Just by way of metaphor, all I can tell you is, so Tim and I are old enough to have lived through the emergence of laser printers, right? Imagine when we were your age, the state of the art for how you would produce a document. Really, one of the only ways you could produce a document, except by drawing it by hand, was on an IBM Selectric typewriter, right? And so there were 3 different fonts. If you wanted to get really wild, you used the Orator font, because the type was a little bigger or something, right? And that was it. And then, around the time the Macintosh arrived on the scene, then there were laser printers, and suddenly anybody could design their own document, right? And if you look around the world, I think you'll see that graphic designers did not go hungry, right? So there is, but still, people are designing stuff. None of you probably employ a graphic designer to do your resume. You know, if you'd have wanted your resume to look the way your current resumes look, in the past you would have had to involve some sort of professional, right? Or you'd have to rub it out letter by letter with the old letraset transfer letters, which you wouldn't want to do that. So yes, people are going to lose their jobs, and millions of other roles will be created. So,
yeah. Well, one last question. Over there. Yep, you.
I've worked both as a designer and a manager of design teams in corporate environments. And my personal experience has been that even if there's buy-in at the top for innovative and creative thinking, that culturally most of the companies, or actually all the companies I've worked in, have been pretty resistant to that. Because there's a lot of risk involved, and of course there might be expense that they might not see the return on their investment. Have you seen a shift? And are you actually actively involved in trying to create a shift within businesses to be more receptive to the design thinking process and design in general?
I mean, I think the best evidence we have of that, I would say yes, we're seeing a shift, is that I think the fastest growing part of our business today is the part that answers the question when the CEO comes and says, I need my organization to be more innovative. So it's essentially a practice of they're sort of organizational designers. They're actually figuring, and we do it in a very simple way. We actually, hey, okay, we'll come and work with you. We'll work on projects together. And we put this learning layer that sits underneath that. A lot of sort of some structural stuff, not much, and that I think is the fastest growing part of our business. So, you know, as an overall percentage of all the companies out in the world, the ones that are coming to ask us and other people those kinds of questions, I don't know how big it is, but you know, I really believe that is because of the state of the times that we're in. That the level. I mean, there was you may all be aware of it, but IBM do a kind of big management survey every couple of years, and the 2010 survey was one based on the challenges of volatility in business, and the top of all of the responses from all of the 1,500 CEOs that they surveyed as to sort of what's the solution to complexity and volatility in the world of business, and it was creativity and creative leadership. So if that's rising to that level of consciousness within business, and we're seeing evidence of more and more companies realizing that they've got to build out those muscles that are on the sort of that give the organization the ability to innovate and adapt and change, then I think it will lead to a greater number of, it'll never be all companies, but it'll lead to a greater number of companies which are sort of healthy environments for designers and design thinkers to exist in.
Yeah, I don't think there's any companies coasting out there. You know, when I grew up in Akron, Ohio, you needed about an innovation once every decade or so. And then the big innovation came along, and it wasn't from Akron, Ohio, it was from Michelin in France, right? And so I think corporate leaders are pretty much scared at this point, right? They know that pieces of their business are being ripped off every day by, you know, worthy competitors, many of them with lower cost bases and stuff like that. And so in that mode, we have their attention. And so I think people are open to this kind of change in a way that they have not been, you know, certainly not a decade ago.
And just to build on that, I would say that the other change that I'm finding tremendously exciting, personally anyway, is that has now leaked out well beyond the world of business. And so that we're seeing kind of equivalent levels of desire for change in the public sector and in the social sector. So in parts of government, it's tricky here in the United States because of the way federal government works, but even within, we're seeing parts of federal government that are very interested in applying these approaches to serving us all as citizens a bit better. There are other countries that are taking it very seriously and applying large amounts of design effort to serving their citizens more effectively. and we're seeing it in the social sector with large foundations. I was very excited. When I was at Davos this January, I was at a lunch in which Bill Gates was talking, and somebody asked him, what's the biggest mistake you made in the first 10 years of the Gates Foundation? And his answer was not realizing that the human systems were as important as the technical systems, which is basically his admission that if we don't get the design bit right, it doesn't matter if we get if we invent the technologies. It doesn't matter if we invent a vaccine. If we haven't got a cold chain to get that vaccine to the people that need to be vaccinated, we haven't got a solution, right? So he that was very interesting, and we're seeing that the kind of opening up of essentially all parts of society to the potential anyway for innovation, for design, for creativity, for great engineering, for all of these things to make more of a difference, which is one of the reasons why I think it's a really cool time to do what we do.
Thank you.
I want to thank you very, very much.